Welcome to Bug Banter with the Xerces Society, where we explore the world of invertebrates and discover how to help these extraordinary animals. If you want to support our work, go to xerces.org/give. Hi, I'm Rachel Dunham in Missoula, Montana.
And I'm Matthew Shepard in Portland, Oregon.
In this episode of Bug Banter, we are closing out our series on butterflies by exploring those in the Rockies. I am especially excited about this one because I live in the Rockies. From prairies to mountaintops, the Rockies are made up of a diversity of ecosystems varying in altitude and temperature. To learn more about these amazing creatures, today we are joined by Steve Armstead, a Pollinator Conservation Specialist with the Xerces Society who has a particular focus on nature-based climate solutions. Steve is based in Colorado, where he partners on efforts to manage and create high-quality, connected, climate-resilient pollinator habitat. Welcome, Steve. We're really excited to have you here.
Well, it's a pleasure, and I know getting all what I do is a mouthful, so thanks.
You're very welcome. I hope I read that okay.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, thanks for joining us today, Steve. As is typical, we kind of like to start by laying the foundation, just going kind of the basics. I mean, what area are we including when we talk about the Rockies, and how many butterfly species are there?
So typically when we think about the Rockies, we're kind of starting in northern New Mexico, where the Rockies really kind of begin and the elevations occur, and then going up through Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, Idaho, and into Montana. And we can keep going north if we want to, but we'll kind of stop there and generally be talking about the Rockies in the states more or less. And the incredible thing about the Rockies is it is a really rich area when we think about butterfly fauna. I know in some of the previous kind of podcasts, we talked about just kind of the richness of some of the Southwest and even Texas in terms of their species diversity. And so the benefit here is the Rockies are kind of nestled up against that. And so, we actually do have some benefit from the diversity of the butterflies there that can move in our part of our area, but also just with the elevation of the Rockies. So if you think about, Texas has over 400 species of butterflies, Arizona over 300, New Mexico itself has just slightly over 300. Here in Colorado, where I am, we have about 290 species of butterfly. And then it progressively gets a little lower as you think about Wyoming or Idaho or even Montana, where you're just around 200. So if we've got 750 species in the US, in some of our areas, we're just under half the species of butterflies that are found in the North America. So pretty incredible.
Yeah, I mean, you just gave us some numbers there, and compared it to overall, all of the US. I mean, compared to, say, the East or the West, the two kind of major regions that butt up against the Rockies, does the Rockies have fewer overall, do you think? Or
no, I'd say I'm lucky because I'm in one of the richest states in general. If you're in a mountain state, you're in kind of the upper echelon of areas where butterflies are going to be more numerous or kind of rich in terms of diversity. So, so I think this is, if you want to kind of look for butterflies in as many different species you can, heading to the Rocky Mountains is not a bad place to go. And part of that, certainly, as I was kind of alluding to, is just the fact that you've got some proximity to where tropical butterflies move up from the south out of Mexico and kind of the warmer states, abutting to kind of species that are coming from the Great Plains from the east. And also, and you've got the west side of the Rockies from the western butterflies that come in. And some of them kind of go back and forth over the peaks. Not many, but because of that, there's an incredible amount of complexity and richness in the number of butterflies that can be found anywhere along the Rockies. And the numbers do drop as you go further north, just because longer winters and a little harsher conditions aren't as favorable for butterflies, which again, kind of from their basis, are more of a tropical species.
Sure. Yeah, that's interesting because I think of the mountains as being cold and therefore less likely to have butterflies in them, and yet they're hot and cold and very rich, which is
yeah. And I think the wonderful thing there is because of that cold environment, you get a lot of unique butterflies, and we can talk a little bit more about that later. But it's that blending from kind of having what species that are well adapted to that more alpine cold environment, down to, the species that are more adapted to warmer, drier environments, the plains environments, but they mix still kind of across the gradient and the elevation changes in the Rockies. And so that's really where that, diversity comes from.
Are there any particular hotspots of diversity in the Rockies?
Well, I'm going to say, and just kind of what I was alluding to there is somewhat the areas of the diversity are really where you have the stream drainages, the canyons, the ravines that come out of the Rockies and connect into either the plains, or kind of on the western side of the Rockies, you get more into your sagebrush and your canyon type habitats. That's actually where the diversity occurs, because you do have this mixing of oftentimes where you have a little bit of moisture, water, whether it's a stream or maybe a little bit of a wetland, which often has a diversity of vegetation associated with it. You've got kind of a corridor or pathway for butterflies to be connected to both that richness of the vegetation, but you've got something in the topography of the land that helps funnel them. And so, I think anytime you come into the Rockies or a mountain area, if you look and seek out those river corridors, the ravines, the canyons, those are going to be the places where you're likely going to find kind of the most range of different types of butterflies on wing or just present in those areas. And so those are kind of the key hotspots always to look at. But if you're going also into, a mountain meadow where there's moisture, kind of breaks in the forested habitat, that's oftentimes a key place, because again, you've got edges there, so you may get some of the more forest species coming out to nectar on the plants that are in kind of the openings, and or butterflies that are more dependent upon the plants in those meadows themselves, as a host plant. So those are all oftentimes kind of spots of diversity. And just thinking again, is the southern part of the Rockies are probably a little more diverse just in general, because they're collecting a little bit more of the strays, or just kind of a broader diversity of what's present in our warmer parts, knowing still that we're talking about the Rockies, and you can get up high and it can be unpleasant at any time of the year, for sure.
That's perfect. It's a great tip. I was out this weekend trying to find some wildflowers and found a great hike in a river drainage, and hiked up and got into a meadow with lots of beautiful native wildflowers. And there were so many butterflies. It was really kind of amazing. So yeah, it all makes sense now.
Yeah. But also there, it's like you maybe have the fortune of being out on one of those perfect days too, when the wind isn't blowing and the sun's out a little bit, and it's like they're rare chances. But when you get at the right time, it's like it is magical, really, with kind of how busy it is. But that's also part is, there's a narrow window of time where those adult butterflies can be active to find a mate, to find a nectaring resource, and then find ideally an ideal host plant if it's a female. So they're going to take advantage of those nice day windows. And so also that's when you're out there, you can see a lot of that diversity, in a very active time frame. And it doesn't happen, of course, in the, winter there, or even in the early spring or late fall. So if you're out in the summertime when things are in bloom and the weather's okay, it can be an incredible experience for sure.
So basically the days when we put our hiking boots and our backpacks on, that's when the butterflies are doing it too.
Yeah, you hope so. Yes. Yeah, if you're not packing your raincoat, it's going to be good.
Yeah, I mean, it's always nice to think about places with lots of butterflies, but I know that we shouldn't overlook places with fewer, especially if the butterflies are unusual. Now, the Rockies have high mountains, which means extreme conditions, rare conditions. And are there butterflies that are unique to the Rockies?
There are, and that's, I think, one of the wonderful things. So again, if the weather conditions are ideal and you can even get up to an alpine area, you're going to be treated by some butterflies you're not going to find in other locations. And kind of one of the things I love is just the names that come with these. So you're talking about butterflies that, like the Melissa Arctic. So again, here's a cold sounding butterfly, but that's the environment it loves. Or the Magdalena Alpine. So again, kind of familiar with the environment it's in, or the rock slide checker spot. So these are butterflies that are in this alpine environment, and they like kind of that rocky talus, kind of rough. And again, they're usually above tree line. So you're talking only about, low growing vegetation, maybe, a few small trees that have been shaped down into krummholz or, shrub type size. But these butterflies, have to kind of contend with that variability in the weather, a very short season, and sometimes, limited access to their host plants. So they are often, the females, if they find or they're in an area of their host plant, whether that's like for the Melissa Arctic or the Magdalena Alpine, a sedge or a grass, particularly nice patch, they're going to spend their time right where their host plants are. And, it's really the males that got to be kind of spending, if they're spending much time on wing, because it's a harsh environment to spend a lot of time on wing, they're going to be kind of flying around or maybe perching on some of these, rocky talus slopes that you find up in the alpine areas, and just kind of wait to see if they can scout out a female. And hopefully, if they do, know that they'll be the first one, and then you start the next generation. But even having the benefit of, okay, I've been successful in finding a mate, then that female again needs to be ideally pretty close to where there's suitable, host plants for them. So they're going to be able to lay their eggs, and with that short season up there, it's like we think typically, okay, great, with butterflies and warmer environments, you might have a generation that occurs all in one summer, or maybe multiple generations. In the alpine, you have a much shorter window, so there's not as much time for a caterpillar to actually feed and grow in size enough that it's going to be able to mature into an adult. So they're going to have to oftentimes do that over multiple seasons. So you may have, for the very first season, the female lay an egg, and that egg may actually overwinter. And then you've got a caterpillar that'll, start feeding and maybe only get through a couple instars before it actually, again, has to wait another winter before it can actually finish feeding and maybe mature. So oftentimes you'll have, for many of these, you'll have, 2 or 3 year cycles, and sometimes even longer, before you can go actually from an egg to a mature adult. So, and that's all just accounting for, you've got maybe a month or two, maybe 3 at the most, where there's a window that's adequate enough for you to be active and available to munch down on your host plant before the weather sets in, the snow sets in.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting, because we tend to think of butterflies as these more ephemeral, short-lived. We grow up as a kid and you're like, oh, that butterfly, it's only going to be alive for a week or 2 weeks, some really short period of time. And yet when you see that adult, it could be 2 years old.
Yeah, right. Exactly it. Exactly it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And just to think about too, it's, some of them have developed a bit of a life cycle as well, that, maybe this is a particularly harsh winter, a long winter, and I may need to actually wait another one before I can, go to my next stage. So some have matured some flexibility, that they're not on such a rigorous cycle, that this is the time frame for which I'm going to mature. It's like I may actually have to wait another cycle too, to wait till there's maybe better conditions for me.
Wow.
That's so interesting. So that sort of leads into this question of, how are butterflies in the Rocky Mountains doing? Are there any species of concern, and specifically with climate change impacting mountain environments and potentially butterflies?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because, certainly the fact that we have these alpine areas, we're in mountains in general, and as we talk about with climate change, potentially warming temperatures or more variable and sometimes extreme weather conditions occurring, that certainly has implications for Rocky Mountain butterflies. So the alpine species, some of the ones I just mentioned, and others, do have limited, and they're well adapted to these extreme environments. But they also are pretty careful and sensitive around temperature. So you can think about, and if you're up, a caterpillar underneath a snowfield, and your life cycle is developed to say, okay, I need to come out in the spring once the snow's melted, and hopefully my host plant is available and growing so I can be able to feed. There's kind of a sequence that occurs there, And with warming temperatures, one of the things that is occurring is sometimes when the snow first is really kind of melted, is becoming earlier and earlier in the spring. And so that, triggers basically the plants sometimes to be able to grow before a caterpillar may be able to come out of its stage, or the plant may not be ready by the time the caterpillar, the things warm up and the caterpillar is ready to eat. So it's important that kind of the host plant and the caterpillar oftentimes stay in sequence with each other. But as there's variability in temperatures, as kind of some of the seasonal variability occurs, that can really offset kind of the ability for that caterpillar and the host plant to be in sequence. And that's a real kind of challenge and probably a risk factor or threat for these high alpine butterflies. And so I think, an example there could be, and certainly one that is recognized as, an endangered species, is the uncompadre fritillary. So this is a small little fritillary up in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado. It is listed as an endangered species under the U.S. Endangered Species Act, primarily because it's just a very small butterfly dependent upon a willow, the snow willow up in these high alpine areas in the southwest Colorado, and they don't stray and go very far from the host plant. And so this small population is kind of restricted to a few mountains, and these changing conditions here, the changing of temperatures, moisture, can all probably affect the host plant, and then this fritillary really doesn't have much ability to move or migrate. It's kind of at the top already of the geographic area, that it can't really move north because it's kind of on an island in space. So those are very, kind of at-risk situations for some of these species that live, if you want, on top of the mountains. They really don't have a place to go. And as kind of the warmer temperatures move up, they're really kind of don't have a way to manage that and kind of move beyond and adjust to the changing situation.
Yeah, because they're already living in the penthouse at the moment, aren't they?
Yeah.
There's
There's nowhere else to go.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know if you had the answer to this question, and I'm kind of throwing at you unexpectedly, but what kind of rate of the temperatures changing? Like for the uncompadre fritillary, it's like 14,000 feet, I think, as its kind of altitude zone for where it lives. And do we have data on temperature change at those kind of levels?
Luckily we do, and I probably don't know the details on that, but there are fortunately some research stations that are really trying to track that. One example is the Rocky Mountain Biological Station outside of Crested Butte, Colorado, which is kind of doing a lot of work across a number of different, animal taxon, but including invertebrates and including butterflies. And so they're tracking, various aspects of both the temperature, climate condition changes over time, but also how, animals are responding to those changes. And they've been doing it for decades. And so, they are documenting that there is, slight increases in temperature. It doesn't take much, whether it's just a percentage of a degree over time, but probably the things that, again, they are triggering is where that has an implication where the snow melt is occurring earlier and earlier in the year, or on the vice, kind of on the other end, conditions are staying warmer later in the year, are where kind of they're seeing things being of greater risk for a number of different taxa, including invertebrates or butterflies, but other species as well, the plants themselves. So I'll just kind of draw another kind of aspect here is one of the, alpine butterflies. It strays down into the montane, and it's pretty broad-based, is the Rocky Mountain Parnassian, which is just it's also, I know, one of my favorite butterflies as well, but it actually feeds on stonecrop, so lanceolatum. And, when you see this butterfly, it's a graceful, big white butterfly. It's an old world swallowtail. So it's, it doesn't have the kind of the protruding tail of a swallowtail, but it's a larger butterfly. It's beautiful. The males just kind of float in the air. And when they're abundant, it's just like in the middle of the summer, you got a bunch of large snowflakes all flying around, an alpine or a subalpine area. But this species of butterfly feeding on the sedum, it uses that chemical. And I know Kevin was talking a little bit previously about some of these secondary chemicals in host plants and how the butterflies incorporate them. Well, that's something that this white butterfly, which is a slow flyer, normally you think that's not probably a safe practice for a butterfly. You're going to be easily preyed upon by something if you're just kind of flitting around. But because it's actually got some of this chemical defense, it has the ability to protect itself, and it gets a secondary chemical, sarmatocin, from the sedum. And I'm bringing this back to climate change. Hang in there with me. is that that chemical is available through the sedum during the wintertime. That plant itself becomes actually toxic to the caterpillar. So during the warmer seasons, or when that caterpillar can graze on it, the caterpillar has the ability to actually manage the toxin, and the toxin level of the plant is kind of manageable to the caterpillar. But during the winter time, that toxicity of that particular chemical is too great for a caterpillar, so it can't graze, or shouldn't graze on that particular plant, which is a fine thing. It's not grazing in the wintertime when they're both blanketed typically under snow. But now go back to that point. Snow's thawing quicker in the springtime. If that plant, again, still has a too high a level of toxin in it, but the caterpillar is now available to graze, you've created a risk factor for this poor little caterpillar. It says, I'm hungry, I finally got the snow off me, but the host plant yet isn't in a compatible condition for that caterpillar to graze on it. It becomes, poison to the caterpillar itself. So things like that relationship can be disrupted by things that we're, with climate change, with changing and variable temperatures, that can be very problematic. So I've got just another example that I think is helpful too, because I'm going to go a little lower in the Rockies, kind of away from the alpine, but just with, climate conditions, we talk about potentially drier conditions or drought type situations. Here in the mountains, again, we've got below the alpine, you got big bands of forested country. And so that brings to mind, you got forests, you got lightning, you got fire potential, you've got humans using these areas, you've got maybe drought conditions, and all this woody, substance available to burn. And, and understandably, kind of forest fires are part of our mountain environment, and many species are well adapted to that. But what they're not well adapted to is when we've got prolonged drought conditions, and the forest conditions are particularly vulnerable to extreme wildfire situations. That causes a challenge. And so I think between, how over time we often haven't done the best job of managing some of our forests. We've, cut them down, let them to grow in more thick, and not allowed sometimes the spacing that allows meadows or, certain forbs to be able to grow that provide the host plant or the nectar resources for butterflies. They kind of get crowded out. That, that becomes an issue. But then too is we have these extreme, fire events that can actually knock out extensive areas of our mountains, which may, if you've got little isolated populations that use certain environments, another threatened species is the Pawnee montane skipper, which occurs in the ponderosa pine forest and is well adapted to feeding on blue grama grass, its host plant, and also his primary nectar source is a blazing star. It needs these two plants to be in close proximity and in a forest condition that is open, that allows the grass and the flower to grow, but also, it's in a ponderosa pine woodland environment. So, it is also with some limited fire, both the plants and the butterfly can adapt to that. But for an extreme event, that you've got a species that only occurs in, a couple counties in Colorado, a large forest fire can put that at risk. And in fact, 20 years ago, we had a large forest fire, which did put a lot of that at risk. So, again, climate conditions changing kind of our wildfire regimes can put some populations of certain species that, don't have a narrow range of geography which they occur, just the right conditions of host plant and, nectar resource. It really puts them at risk.
Some sobering information there. Thanks, Steve.
Sorry, yeah.
No,
I
it's
don't
all
want to be downer. We
No,
went from, oh, this is such a wonderful thing. Go up and see, the snowflakes flying in the middle of this, in the summer in the Alpine, and these great experiences of all the butterflies in the, Alpine meadows. And then, oh, but there's a risk.
And that kind of segues into, I mean, you talked about all this, the threats, what we know about it. So that means that there must be ways in which we know how these butterflies are doing, the ways in which we're collecting this kind of information and data. So, I mean, are there surveys being done at the moment? Or, I mean, are there ways in which people can contribute to understanding this situation facing our butterflies?
Yeah, I think thanks for asking this question, because I think it's really important. And I mentioned a little bit just with the Rocky Mountain Biological Station. One of the wonderful things is we're able to put, some incredible information out there about how does climate change affect. Part of that is because there are scientists doing long-term studies, for over 20, 30 years, looking at the same factors over time to see how that changes. And, some of the early studies over 20 years ago up in our Rocky Mountain Biological Station were on butterflies. And there's work underway again to repeat those studies. So, we can kind of do that comparison over time. There are other kind of long-term studies that have been done in Rocky Mountain National Park, and I mentioned when we first started kind of the number of butterflies, in Rocky Mountain National Park, which is just, an hour's drive from where I live, there's over 141 species of butterfly that occur just in that national park. And I was fortunate enough to know an individual who said, it's really important. Here's this gem of a national park. We want to know more about what's happening and what butterflies are here and what's happening to those butterflies. And so, he set up, just out of his own interest, basically transects in many of the different habitats in the national park, and eventually got a number of volunteers to do that. And these are the kind of a pollard walk. So it's kind of a system where you have maybe a kilometer long transect, and you establish basically at the time it was like a 5-meter box around you of space that you just slowly walk through, that environment along your transect, and you count all the butterflies that you see. So you should repeat that over time, over the course of a summer and over a course of number of years, and you can start to understand some of the kind of trends of what's happening with certain species, but also over time collect, because again, we talked earlier, not all butterflies are out every year. And or conditions may be more favorable in a certain year. You're not in a drought, you're actually in a great moisture year where you may actually get more hooked plants and therefore more, kind of abundance of certain butterflies. And so you can kind of get a glimpse at what's happening and create some baselines around that, and also get to understand. You can actually come up with an ability to say there's 141 species here, and do that in a more rigorous way. So, there's those transects were, run for about 15 years, but it gives a great baseline over that time frame and something we can go back and repeat. There's other work in Colorado that's kind of Colorado Butterfly Monitoring Network doing same thing, kind of pollard walks in a bunch of different areas across the state, collecting a baseline of information. So I think those type of long-term surveys, they take a lot of effort, but they're incredibly important. And that effort really, we can't always just count on scientists doing that, because that would be wonderful, but we just don't have enough scientists, frankly, with that expertise. And that we don't always need all the in-depth expertise. What we can also really benefit by is people who can learn enough, and engage with understanding to how to identify, some of the butterflies that you're going to encounter, and then go out and do these transects themselves. So there's a lot of different, ways you can engage in citizen science, be maybe engaged in a formal transect type walk, or frankly too, just as you're out and about with, programs like iNaturalist. You see a butterfly, it's on a flower, snap a photo, and add that to iNaturalist, or maybe there's another citizen science project in an area that's more specific for trying to identify the butterflies in your area. If there are, engage with those, because that kind of crowdsourcing of that information really does help to track, what butterflies occur where, which nectar resources are they dependent upon. And that's really, for us, incredibly important information that the science, is really growing about how to use that information and make benefit of that. So I think there's a lot of benefit there. And over time, we can actually track too of how are things changing, use that information to look at maybe there's, well, we can look at climate information and changes or models. We can also just look at management practices, land conversion, or management practices. So that was in somewhat kind of where I got into thinking more about butterflies is when I worked in a open space system outside of Boulder. And, we did a lot of work to look at birds and mammals, but we really didn't do much about insects. And I knew at the time, it's like, well, there's a lot closer relationship between how you're managing your vegetation, your resources, and what's that mean for the invertebrates. And so if you don't really make the ability to understand that connection, you're really losing a more direct link to, are we doing the right things to manage the vegetation that helps create the whole foundation for a habitat, a healthy habitat. And so that kind of motivated me to say, well, I think it's really important to set up, a butterfly monitoring system in this open space system, so we could understand a little bit more about the butterflies that were occurring, but also understand a little bit about some of the management practices where, we were doing agricultural haying or so forth, or, maybe to some extent understanding as trails get developed, are there changes that are occurring in the way you can manage, and is there a way to track butterfly communities over time that could give you some insights of things you have to be, thinking around when you want to manage or make sure you're doing the best you can for managing the natural resources of an area.
What you were saying about the connection between the management and butterflies as a kind of indicator species I think is really valuable, because as our listeners, if they listen to all three of these series of butterfly talks, each time there's been this emphasis or this mention of this really intimate connection between plants and the butterflies. And in the end, the management that you do will typically influence the vegetation and plant communities, which, the presence or not of butterflies is a really good indicator of that health.
Yeah, no, it's key. I mean, even here, we're talking about the Rocky Mountains, but the amazing thing too is the Rockies, there are pockets of where there's relic vegetation. I just outside of Boulder, I know I go to a little canyon that has birch trees in it and wood lilies. Something that doesn't normally occur in Colorado. It's much more part of the northern or even eastern part of the states. And yet, just over kind of time, this little pocket has held in the right conditions. It's kind of on the north side of a mountain, so it's cooler. It's where this kind of relic vegetation occurs. And yet, I know also to go there because I'm going to see probably some butterflies or some invertebrates I'm not seeing elsewhere. Because again, there's this unique little pocket, and that happens too with just some of the mesas, the old outwash from the ancient Rockies. Where there's tall grass prairie just right up against the foothills, and incredibly rich diversity of species, and some real kind of butterflies or little skippers that are on the edge of their habitat but are holding tight, which is great. Yet any sort of development conversion of that space into houses or otherwise, or poor land management, overgrazing, jeopardizes these kind of small little pockets of uniqueness.
Yeah.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about and ideas of how to help butterflies. And in past episodes, we've talked a lot about planting native plants. And as you've mentioned, getting involved with community science. But I love that you're here because we have a story of hope that I was hoping you could discuss a little bit. And it's quite a big deal. So I'm excited that we get to share this with folks if they're not aware of what's happening in Colorado. But there was a recent win for pollinators in the state that you were
Yay.
deeply involved in, along with some other staff at Xerces. Can you tell us a little bit about this effort and what it means for butterflies and other pollinators?
Yeah, no, it's kind of one of the joys I have about working with Xerces is kind of the diversity of things I can get involved in. But this one was kind of an opportunity where I think circumstances just were in the right situation in the state where we had, our Department of Natural Resources that was recognizing and hearing, I think, a lot from the Colorado community that we've got to be paying attention to our pollinators. And also a governor who was aware that this is probably important. And also a recognition that Colorado was one of the 9, but one of the few states, unfortunately, that didn't recognize pollinators or any invertebrate as wildlife. Therefore, our wildlife agency in the state didn't have really any direct authority to develop programs or manage, butterflies, let alone bees, let alone fireflies, let alone ants, or anything else that, could be looked at as an invertebrate. And so there was a kind of an initiative by our Colorado legislature, a bill proposed that let's actually change that situation. And so they worked carefully with our Department of Natural Resources, kind of talked about what would be a way to step in and give more, ability for our wildlife agency to actually manage invertebrates, but be careful too, because there's concerns when you kind of go wholesale and say, now we're going to start managing invertebrates. That is for an agency or a state that hasn't done that, that's a big change. So I think there was a lot of careful conversation about how do we make a change here. And what they said is, in part of what the legislation approved was, we need to make sure invertebrates, butterflies are included. And so they created a bill that says we want to directly give our wildlife agency that authority. We're going to be careful. We know there's concerns about what does this mean? Does this mean a lot more new regulations? And so it was really said we're going to focus first on being able to develop management programs and study. So we really know more about how to protect butterflies and our invertebrates, and then we can, if need be, think about later and make sure we're addressing if there are regulatory. That could be something potentially that happens down the road, but that's not that kind of the initial piece here. But because I think there was kind of careful conversation and crafting of the legislation, it was actually able to be approved by the Colorado State Legislature this past spring and then signed off just a couple of weeks ago by Governor Polis with Colorado. So now actually we have going forward the ability for our parks and wildlife to develop programs to actually work with organizations like Xerces to figure out where are the areas we really need to focus on for the invertebrates. And for me, it's like, what butterflies, do we need to really be thoughtful around? There's more than just those that are listed, as endangered or threatened. There are other imperiled species. Some of these are in these relic grasslands, or some of those, again, up on the mountaintops. We might want to make sure we know more about how they're doing or some of the threats they're doing. And so now we can actually, do a lot of collaborative work to think about that. And I think the other key piece there is, other than just giving this authority, there was actually positions. So wildlife positions that were funded with this bill too, so that there's actually staffing that's available to do that work, which is huge. And so this is a significant change for Colorado, and everybody's, that I collaborated with to help support the bill, and those who are just thinking about the importance of pollinators, it's brought a lot of excitement.
Yeah, I think the other thing that's worth mentioning here, Steve, is that this bill also came out following a report. I thought you were going to talk about the report to start with, but you didn't. You kind of glossed over it, and I don't want to ignore that, because the report that you were instrumental on, along with your co-authors from the Extension Service and the university, spent a year putting together an assessment, an overview of the state of the science relating to pollinators in Colorado, and reviewed all the policies and the agencies and came up with recommendations on what could be done within the state of Colorado to support the pollinators. So
I knew I was going to be, I'm long-winded, Matthew, and I knew if I got into that too, I'd be even extending that segment a lot longer. So you're right, I glossed over that, but I so appreciate you connecting the dots there, because it's an important piece that led, certainly to setting the stage for the legislation.
Yeah, because the co-authors were Darren and Adrian, weren't they?
Yes, yeah. And then, we had another 16 scientists, that Adrian is a scientist from the University of Colorado Museum of Nature and Science, was able to, get information. We had certainly a lot of collaboration from all the expertise in the Xerces Society.
Well, thank you, Steve, for
yes.
for the work that you've done. Sorry, but also thank you for this conversation. I mean, it's been great talking with you and learning. I mean, learning so much more about the Rockies and the butterflies, etc. It's always sad when we get to the point where we have to wrap these up, but the silver lining of reaching the end is that we get to ask our favorite question, which is, what inspired you to want to work with insects?
Oh, boy, given some thought to this, it's like the first thing I remember is I grew up in Colorado on a I call it a lake, but it was a reservoir. We have very few real lakes here in Colorado, but part of the reservoir had, a marsh area with a lot of milkweed in it. And so with the milkweed as a kid, I would see the monarchs coming in. And so that captured my attention immediately. It was these big, beautiful, orange butterflies. So I dug in with all the books that I could about kind of the monarchs. And that's what always had for me kind of a baseline. This is something I'm just fascinating, and butterflies are cool. The whole metamorphosis, the whole life stages, that's really cool. And, it's always, it was a passion, but it was really in college, actually, that things started to connect the dots for me. And in part, I did an intern at a park outside of Boulder. And, it was great. As an intern, we were supposed to do these, kind of a project as part of our internship. And we had brochures about the mammals, and we had brochures about the wildflowers and the geology. And it's like, you know what? Butterflies, those are even cooler. People need to know about butterflies. So I made it my mission to do a brochure about butterflies. And so that kind of like, wait a minute, this is something I really want to learn even more about in a more rigorous way and really kind of get to understand it. It was also at a time when digital photography, and this is going to date me a little bit here, but when digital photography was just starting to really come out, and it's like, oh, what do you mean? I can snap as many pictures of something and then take that back and really understand what I was looking at? Oh, how cool. So it really kind of elevated my interest of being able to go up, take a bunch of pictures, and then sit with those pictures and kind of relate. Oh, what butterfly am I seeing here, and why is it here, and what plant is it on, type thing. So that kind of started from there, a lifelong passion of just paying attention to butterflies and the environments that they're being found in.
That's great. And you're worried about being aged because you remember the beginning of digital. I'm like, oh.
I go well beyond that, but yes.
Well, thank you, Steve, so much. This has been just so interesting. And again, thank you and everyone who worked so hard to make such a meaningful impact in the state of Colorado. And it's exciting to hear that other states are sort of hopefully looking to that and making those changes as well and taking those steps forward. But thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your stories and your knowledge. And we hope to have you back again, as we do with all of our guests, but it's been a real pleasure.
It's been fun for me. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Bug Banter is brought to you by the Xerces Society, a donor-supported nonprofit that is working to protect insects and other invertebrates, the life that sustains us. If you're already a donor, thank you so much. If you want to support our work, go to xerces.org/donate. For information about this podcast and show notes, go to xerces.org/bugbanter.